My name is Mary Dellenbaugh-Losse. Welcome back to my 10-minute talk series in which I explore complex urban development topics in 10 minutes or less. This month I want to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our use of and perception of public space in our cities. So lockdowns during the pandemic meant that we lost our third spaces. And third spaces are a concept from sociology where we have our first spaces, our home, our second spaces, our work, and our third spaces, which are all these various spaces we go to in the course of our recreation and social activities. It's our fitness studios, it's our dance studios, it's our bars, the restaurants, etc. We were confined not only to our first and second spaces, but only our first spaces, work from home, do everything from home. And that meant that we had a much higher need for public space. So as individuals, we were increasingly using public spaces in our cities for our own private physical and social activities. So sports, meeting friends, going for walks, etc. In addition, cities and municipalities supported these activities by changing the uses of public spaces. So we suddenly saw play streets here in Berlin, streets which were cordoned off so that children could play in them, in part because our playgrounds were closed for a while. We also saw street and sidewalk spaces increasingly being used for special permitting processes for outdoor dining in order to allow for more space between diners and between tables. So we saw a privatization and a commercialization of public space, albeit temporarily. Cities seized the opportunities to increase bike mobility, for example, by increasing the width of existing bike lanes, by creating new pop-up bike lanes, and many of which are now becoming permanent. Through all of these different pandemic-related changes, there was a much higher pressure on our urban public spaces, from parks to sidewalks to streets. And because indoor spaces were limited or closed, many of these public spaces were used for private or commercial interests. This allowed us to really examine our public spaces. What are they for? What do we need them for? And in many cases, we discovered that public space is absolutely necessary for our social, political, and societal life in cities. I think one of the other additional benefits that we saw during the pandemic, and in particular in the use of streets and sidewalks, is that cities actually have the ability to flexibly allocate this space to new and different uses. And that has allowed us to really experiment with the use of parking spaces, the use of street spaces, and think about new conceptualizations of what our cities could look like after the pandemic is over. I think another reason why we have really begun to reassess our public spaces and our local spaces is because many of us were simply stuck in our own neighborhoods and in our own cities. And that gave us the chance to really look around at what's around us, look at the spaces around us, and really assess, what am I using, what's here, and how would I like to use it in the future? So on the one hand, the pandemic has led us to become a bit more conscious of how private interests have really taken over some public spaces. Now, I know that these uses are temporary, and I do support the way that these uses of space, for example, outdoor dining, have allowed local businesses to survive and thrive, or at least survive, during this very, very difficult time, in particular during lockdowns. Nonetheless, I do see the use of public space through private interests critically. Here in Berlin, we've got a lot of different uses that are trying to use, for example, our sidewalk space. We have cafes, we've got electric scooters, we've got bicyclists, we've got pedestrians. So we've got a lot of different things happening in a very small space. And I think it's just important to keep it top of mind that this space is intended for us to move through, and it's a public space. It's a space that's meant for everyone to be able to use. And I think while it's fine to have some temporary uses, it's also important that we do remember that these are public spaces. The other thing that the pandemic has shown us is how absolutely critical these green spaces are for our quality of life. Green spaces are not only important as the green lungs of the city to help promote air quality and cooling in the heat island effect that cities often have, they're also critical spaces of cultural expression, social expression, sports, recreation, and just relaxing social time. So I'll be excited to see how these developments and this conversation continues. We have this unique opportunity to really push forward innovation in terms of our public spaces and how we want to use the spaces in our neighborhoods. What does that look like? What does it look like when a neighborhood has enough green space, enough space to play in? What does that mean for the people who live there, who were stuck there over the pandemic? I think we have the unique opportunity right now in our municipalities to initiate a participatory dialogue about what our city should look like coming out of the pandemic. It can't just be a top-down process. So those are a few examples from Berlin today. I'd be really interested to hear what it's like in your city. So if you want, comment on this video, and I'd be really interested to see what the changes are that are happening in your area. As always, if you want to see more content like this, you can subscribe to my channel or follow me on Twitter at @MDL_Berlin. See you soon!